Hi, this is Sam Botstein from MachineSkills.com. In today's tutorial, we're going to look at some ways to use creative effects chains, namely a saturation effect and a flanger effect in series, for sound design with 808 sounds. In a previous tutorial, we looked at some sound design possibilities using an 808 cowbell in Fabfilter's Timeless 2 filter delay effect. This tutorial focused more on how to map macros to control important parameters in the VST. This time we're going to focus more on the straight-up sound design possibilities that are offered by both the built-in machine effects and a dedicated saturation VST, Fabfilter Saturn. Here are what our finished results will sound like. That is with the built-in machine effects. This is what it can sound like with a dedicated VST. Looking at using the built-in effects first, let's take a look at just this kick drum. We'll solo it so we can hear it alone, and I'm going to turn off the saturator so we can hear what it sounds like all by itself. This sounds pretty good already, so we have a good default sound to work from. You can load up the sound in your machine software really easily. It is just from the 808 Southern kit. The only way that I've changed this from the way that it default loads is I've just lowered the pattern length from 8 to 4 bars so that we're always hearing this kick as opposed to this stuff over here. And I've replaced the cowbell with the cowbell we made last week with Fabfilter's Timeless 2. When you load up a saturator effect, it is going to right away change the sound. The built-in init patch, the way it loads up when you just load the saturator effect, has a very nearly perfect effect on an 808 bass drum. This already sounds really good to me. It sounds a lot more interesting and usable than this built-in 808 kick sound. Let's A/B them. Let's hear the dry kick and then the saturated kick. So in classic and tape mode, this saturator effect has only 3 encoder controls. These are input, contour, and drive, as you can see, and drive is the one that will most affect the sound. It isn't the dry-wet control, but it does affect just how much the saturator will affect the incoming audio. With the drive all the way down, we can get some interesting effects using just the input and the contour. The contour control will do very little when drive is all the way down. However, if we turn up the input, we can get some subtle saturation effects. So here is the dry kick once more. And here's what it sounds like with the drive all the way down. As you can hear, we get a more subtle kind of effect, and the contour control does very, very little when the drive is down. Also, we're going to hear this little distorted noise at the end of the audio. Let's hear that one more time. This is a really interesting character to work with, and when we use the flanger, that audio will come through the flanger and make some interesting noise. Now let's play with the drive a little bit. If we turn the drive all the way up, we'll get a very, very extreme effect. Depending on what kind of music you're making, there are a lot of good sweet spots for just the drive control. This contour control will sort of act as a sustain, meaning you'll get a saturated sound for the length that you specify here. If we have it all the way down towards 0, we're just going to get a saturated transient. But if we pull it all the way up to 100, we're going to get a saturated sound throughout the entire audio. This kind of thing can really help turn a regular 808 kick drum into a really interesting dynamic line, especially when you're using automation to control these controls. Let's take a look at the other two modes. Tape is a lot more subtle to my ears. It's clearly supposed to be an emulation of the kind of tape saturation, which is nice because that's what we're used to hearing 808s through. Let's listen to some different possibilities there. If you put a scope on the output here, you'll notice that we get a really different frequency response as we turn up the input. To me, I can hear the relationship between the top and the bottom, the treble and the bass, change really dynamically as I move above 12 dB. Finally, there is a tube mode. This mode uses all 8 of the available controls on the machine controller, meaning there are 8 individual controls, and 2 of these are actually switches. So this overload control can be really dynamic. If we just hear our kick with and without it, we'll hear some interesting dynamic effects. The EQ bypass can also be really interesting. Let's say that we turn the treble all the way down and the bass all the way up, just for demonstration. Here, when we turn the bypass on and off, we're going to get a really different sounds. This can all be really useful. This charge control can do a lot of really interesting things to our drum sounds. This gain control can be really useful as it can help us to just attenuate the really loud sounds that will come if we turn up all of these different controls before it. Moving it the other way, we can actually get a lot of punch out of this saturation effect without having to load a maximizer or a compressor after it. Let's leave our saturation effect the way it is here and just load up a flanger after it in the chain. I changed the modulator to an envelope instead of an LFO and turned the amount down because I didn't like that sort of funny, crispy thing we were getting on the attack or the transient of the kick. We can also turn this feedback control up and get a really interesting line that will happen just from the flanger being fed this saturated 808 kick drum sound. So with the feedback up and the frequency down, we can get some really earth-shattering sounds. We can also get some really interesting dynamic effects by using this invert control. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to flip this invert switch right when we get to bar 2. This is a really powerful way to take an ordinary sound from the Maschine library and turn it into something that will be really interesting for a lot of different types of productions. Let's leave these built-in effects the way they are and take a look at using Fabfilter Saturn. The first thing that you'll notice about using Saturn is that it has some of the same controls. You see some drive controls, a kind of a tone control like we saw on the tube mode, as well as feedback controls, and a dry-wet mix control. It also has all of these modulation options we saw last week using Fabfilter's Timeless 2, and it has the ability to A/B sounds, or compare two different patches. Here I have the default setting, so we can work our way to our finished result here. So this is what our effect will sound like in the init patch, the default setting. You'll notice a sort of a readout here of our frequency spectrum, which will be really useful, especially when we start to add multiple bands. Speaking of multiple bands, we can add another band really easily. All we have to do is go up to the top here and click this little plus sign. You can have a lot of bands if you so choose. However, the more bands that you do add, the more control you have, and your sound might get a little overprocessed. So here's what it would sound like if we used all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these bands and had individual drive controls for each of them. Now, notice how Fabfilter Saturn will actually color these for us so we can see just how much is being affected. One interesting thing that we could do with so many bands, though, is use all of these pan controls. So we could take let's leave the bass in the middle, but we can take this low end here and put it to the right, the next band to the left, and so forth. And get a really big, crazy stereo image. To me, this already gives us a much, much warmer sound than we were getting with the built-in saturation effect. If we just go back to our default setting here, we can take a look at some of the different modes available to us. So, using these sort of extreme styles, we can get a lot of interesting sort of circuit-bent sounds. We can also use some really classic warm sounds like the warm tube that it loaded to, but we also have some really interesting possibilities. For example, the Rectify and Destroy styles that I just showed were really, really interesting, especially when varying up the mix control. This broken tube control is really, really nice. I'm a big fan of analog tube-based processing, and I really love my broken stuff, or my Metasonics hardware, which is made to sound broken. And here's some possibilities that we can get just with the feedback control and the drive control using this broken tube style in just one band. Of course, we can also modulate these parameters. We have all sorts of different possibilities between an XY thing, but also we have an LFO like we used in the last week's tutorial. Let's just apply this LFO to, let's say, the mix control here. So this varies up the kind of kick sounds we're getting, but it's a little too crazy to be useful as it is right now. If we change it up from being a free thing to, let's say changing every bar or so, we'll get a really interesting effect. This way we can ensure that we get the sort of dry 808 sound that we were looking for on the first beat, and then as the bar continues, we get these crazy broken tube saturator sounds. We also have the ability to control more than one parameter with any of these modulation controls. So let's just take this XLFO and have it connected to drive as well. You'll notice that you get to have depth controls for all of these different mappings, and you can invert them as well, which is what I did there. This way, we're getting a special different drive curve, and I turned down the mix level just a little bit so that we will always hear a little bit of the saturation effect, as opposed to letting the LFO turn it all the way up or all the way down. There are a lot of possibilities just using one band in this default setting. However, Fabfilter has included a 808 designer preset. Here we get 3 bands, so we can do a sort of rough 3-band EQ thing. Let's hear what this sounds like right now. You'll also notice that we can have different styles for different bands. So here we have heavy saturation in the mid band and a clean tube saturation in the high band. Of course, all of these controls are independent, so we have independent tone controls for each band and so forth. A lot of these presets come with built-in XY controls, which can be really useful. However, we're going to use one of the other modulation options, the envelope follower. I really like envelope followers for drums. It really lets you sort of follow the transient or the amplitude envelope and map that to some parameter. So here what we're going to do is we're just going to map it to a couple of different parameters. We're going to take a look at mapping it to the drive, of course, the big knob, the parameter of the effect that has the biggest effect on the sound, but also the mix and feedback. So we're going to tighten up this attack and release, and then we're going to use this little crosshair to map these 3 different parameters. Now that we have these parameters mapped, we'll hear the parameters move as the sound plays. When we move the knobs while they're mapped to modulators like this, they work as offsets. This way I can turn the feedback all the way down, and the envelope follower will only turn it up this much. So this way it's going to sort of only turn about this far, if you can visualize that. So this is already a lot. I really like the sort of echo we're getting when we stop playing. However, this is only mapped to band 1. One really nice thing that we could do is we could go ahead and map this envelope follower to the other 2 bands, but we could also just go and get another one, or some other modulator even. So let's grab another envelope follower. Maybe we'll have an attack that's not quite as aggressive and it will release a little bit longer. And we're going to map this to the drive of the middle band, and maybe also the mid-band's different tone controls. So we can, maybe have a mid control that will go up quite a bit, and a treble control which will go down about a little bit more than halfway. One other thing that would be really nice is to just map it to the overall level. So let's go ahead and do that as well. I'm actually going to invert this so the level comes up as it follows the envelope. It's going to sound a little interesting. Here's what it'll sound like now. So now we have this really interesting tail on the end of our kick drum sound. We're going to go ahead and add a flanger, and just as before, we're going to play with especially the frequency and the feedback controls to sort of design an interesting sound. I really like the way that sounds, but we're not hearing enough of the kick drum dry. So I'm going to pull down the mix quite a bit here, and we'll hear what it sounds like now. I'm thinking that maybe the oscillations of this flanger are going in the wrong direction. So let's turn up the invert and see how that goes. In order to have this cut through, we're going to turn down this mix or output control even further, and we're going to pull up a compressor as well. This is what our finished 808 kick sound sounds like. It kind of adds a new line to our 808 pattern here. If we hear it in context, we'll hear just why this is so exciting and useful. We know that we can control all of this extra new material that we have coming just from this 808 sound just by where we put these 808 kicks. So if I go ahead and I take a bunch of them out, this can give a welcome break. In the sound that we made last week, which is right here on our cowbell sound, is sort of on all the time. The delay will ring out for a really long time and even self-oscillate if you just move around this filter control. So here's what the sound we made last week, along with the sound we made this week, sound like. Last week we used Fabfilter's Timeless 2, and this week we used Fabfilter's Saturn. Here's what it all sounds like together. As you can hear, we're moving right along, turning a standard 808 kit into a really crazy sound design project. Let us know in the comments how you use these different effects chains in your own productions, and make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and check us out at machineseals.com.